Last Halloween, my friends and I decided to explore the abandoned house at the edge of town. We'd all heard the stories about it. The strange red light that sometimes appeared in the windows. The rumors of people disappearing after venturing inside. But we were skeptical, chalking it up to urban legends meant to scare us. We wanted to see it for ourselves, and what better time to do it than Halloween? The house was dilapidated, barely holding itself up, with shattered windows and a door that hung crookedly from its hinges. As we stepped inside, the floorboards creaked under our feet, and a musty smell filled the air. We each had flashlights, but the beams barely lit up the large rooms. The house was strangely quiet, like it was waiting for something to happen. In Scooby style, we decided to split up, searching each room. But there was nothing unusual, just old furniture covered in dust, faded wallpaper peeling off the walls, and a staircase that looked ready to collapse. That's when we noticed the red light. It was faint at first, like a glow coming from upstairs. My stomach turned, but I brushed it off, trying to ignore the unease gnawing at me. But as we moved toward the stairs, the light grew stronger, casting a glow over the walls. My friend Jake took the lead. His flashlight flickered as he ascended the steps. As we reached the top, we found ourselves in a long hallway with closed doors on either side. The red light was coming from the last door at the end of the hall. "It's probably just some old lamp," Jake said, though he sounded afraid. We crept toward the door, our footsteps echoing in the silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. When we reached the door, we hesitated, exchanging uneasy glances. Finally, Jake pushed it open and we stepped inside. The room was empty, save for a single chair in the center facing the doorway. A red bulb hung from the ceiling, casting an unnatural glow that filled the room. As we entered, the door slammed shut behind us, and the light started flickering, making shadows that seemed to move. "Who closed the door?" I yelled. No one answered. We tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The air grew colder, and the walls seemed to close in on us. That's when we heard it. A faint whisper, coming from nowhere and everywhere all at once. "Leave," it said with a low and guttural voice. We froze, our eyes scanning around the room, but there was no one there. "Open the door, Jake," I said. I was starting to freak out. He twisted the handle, but it wouldn't move. And then, the light flickered off completely, plunging us into total darkness. We stood there in silence, too scared to move, waiting for the light to come back on. But instead, the whisper and voices grew louder, like they were circling us, surrounding us. Suddenly, the light flickered back on, and we all gasped. Standing in the center of the room, in the exact spot we'd just been staring at, was a figure. It was tall, with long dark hair covering its face. Its skin was pale and thin, almost translucent. Its head was tilted slightly, as if it were studying us. And then, without a sound, it lunged. We panicked, scrambling toward the door, pounding on it, screaming for help. But the figure was relentless, its movements fast and jerky, like it was being controlled by invisible strings. It ran around the room, almost hitting us. It was almost like it couldn't see. The whispers turned to screams, filling the room as the creature closed in on us. Its face was indescribable. I've never felt so afraid in my entire life. It looked like a rotten human, except it was alive. Just when I thought it was over, the door burst open and we stumbled out into the hallway. We didn't look back. We raced down the stairs, through the broken door, and out into the night, gasping for breath. When we reached the street, we turned back to look at the house, expecting to see that red light in the window or the creature following us. But the house was dark, silent, as if nothing had happened. The next day, we went back to the house and the red light was on again. However, this time we just moved on. There was no way we were going back in after what happened yesterday. The house still stands there to this day. In college, I took on a night shift job as a security guard at a local medical research facility. It wasn't a glamorous gig, but the pay was decent, and the shifts were quiet. The building was a sprawling two-story structure from the 1970s, with long, sterile hallways and an unsettling silence that only got thicker as the night wore on. The job itself was simple: monitor the cameras, do a few rounds, and report any unusual activity. But I soon learned the facility had a history. Over the years, it had been a hospital, a psych ward, and then finally this research center. Most people had no idea, but it didn't take long for me to start noticing things that didn't feel quite right. Shadows would flicker on the cameras, lights would switch off and on in empty rooms, and every now and then, I'd catch what looked like someone walking through a locked door. But my first truly disturbing experience happened about a month in. I was doing a routine patrol on the second floor when I felt an overwhelming sense of unease as I neared room 203. It was one of the old patient rooms, and rumor had it that it was used for special cases back in the psych ward days. People swore they'd heard screams coming from it on quiet nights, even though the room was empty and unused now. One night, as I was walking past 203, I heard something faint, a soft, high-pitched hum almost like a lullaby. It was quiet enough to ignore, but as I continued down the hall, the sound grew louder until I couldn't ignore it anymore. Against my better judgment, I turned back, standing outside room 203 with my heart pounding, listening to the eerie melody. With a shaky hand, I turned the knob and opened the door. Inside, the room was dark, only dimly lit by the emergency lights in the hall behind me. There was no one there, just the empty bed and the sterile, outdated furniture. But the lullaby was louder now, filling the room as if it were coming from all directions at once. I flicked my flashlight on and swept it across the room, half expecting to see something. But there was nothing, just silence and shadows. I stepped back, closed the door, and practically sprinted down the hallway, telling myself it was my imagination. But the thing is, after that night, the sounds only got worse. Every shift around the same time, I'd hear the hum. It would start faint and grow louder, always near room 203. It began to feel as though the room itself was calling to me, inviting me in, daring me to open the door again. I'd avoid that hallway whenever I could, but in my rounds, it was unavoidable. One night, about 2 weeks after the first incident, I heard a knock from inside room 203. 3 deliberate knocks, slow and rhythmic. I froze, staring at the closed door. My instinct told me to run, but my training, or maybe my pride, made me stay. I raised my radio and called my supervisor, reporting the noise. He was silent for a moment before saying, "Room 203 has been sealed for years. Just finish your rounds and stay out of that room." The next day, I asked the day shift guard about room 203. He looked at me, a bit wary, and said, "Man, don't mess around with that room. I've heard things too. Nobody's supposed to go in there. Not since, well, let's just say, not since the incident." I pressed him for more, but he clammed up and left it at that. That night, as I was walking down the first floor corridor, I caught a glimpse of movement on one of the monitors. Room 203's door was open. My stomach dropped. There was no way it should be open, and yet there it was, the door slightly open with the faintest light spilling out into the hall. I took a deep breath, my hand going to the flashlight on my belt. I didn't want to go up there, but a strange pull kept me moving forward. When I got to the second floor, I could see the door was indeed cracked open, with that faint, sickly yellow light illuminating the floor just outside the room. Swallowing my fear, I crept closer, pushing the door open with one finger, shining my flashlight inside. The room was empty, just as it had always been. But now, in the far corner, there was something on the floor. It was a doll, old and worn, with glassy eyes that seemed to glint in the light. Beside it was a child's music box, the source of the lullaby I'd been hearing. The music slowed to a stop as I stepped into the room, my flashlight casting long shadows across the walls. Just then, I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. I whipped around, but there was no one there. The door creaked shut behind me, and suddenly, the room was pitch black. My flashlight flickered and died. Panicking, I fumbled with it, my hands shaking as I tried to get it to work again. Then, in the silence, I heard it, a soft giggle followed by a child's whisper.
Stay and play with me.
I ran for the door, but it wouldn't budge. I yanked on the handle, kicking and slamming my shoulder against the door, but it was as if it had been welded shut. The giggling grew louder, and I felt icy fingers brush against my arm. In a final desperate attempt, I threw my weight against the door, and this time it flew open. I stumbled into the hallway. My heart was in my throat, gasping for air. I didn't look back as I ran down the hall, through the stairs and out of the building, ignoring my supervisor's voice crackling over the radio, demanding to know where I was going. The next day, I quit without a word. I didn't care about the paycheck anymore. I just wanted to get as far away from that place as possible. Every year, my friends and I went on a camping trip to celebrate the end of summer. This year, we chose a secluded trail in the mountains, known for its supposed ghostly legends. We shrugged off the warnings, seeing it as an adventure, a way to end the season with a good scare. What we didn't expect was that one of those legends would become all too real. It was the second night when things started getting strange. We had just finished cooking dinner, and as the darkness settled around us, an eerie silence took over the forest. I tried brushing it off, but it felt unnatural. The usual nighttime sounds, crickets, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, were absent, as if the forest was holding its breath. "You guys hear that?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Hear what?" Danny laughed, though it sounded forced. "Exactly. There's nothing." Mia looked at me, frowning. "It's just quiet out here. Nothing to freak out about." But there was an uneasiness between us that was hard to shake. We spent the next hour making small talk and telling ghost stories to lift the mood. But as we settled into our sleeping bags, a noise cut through the silence. It was faint at first, like slow footsteps. I strained my ears, telling myself it was probably a deer or some other animal wandering nearby. But then the sound grew louder and closer. Everyone in the tent was silent. I held my breath, hoping it would go away, but the footsteps continued. They now sounded like they were circling our tent. Danny, the bravest of us, whispered, "Probably just some hikers messing with us." He unzipped the tent a little to peek outside, but quickly pulled the zipper back down, his face pale. "What is it?" I asked. "There's someone out there." His voice was barely a whisper. A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean, someone?" "A man," he replied, eyes wide, standing in the clearing, just staring at the tent. We all went silent, waiting, listening. The footsteps started up again, moving slowly around the tent, and then stopped directly in front of the entrance. A shiver ran through me as I realized whoever was outside was standing right there, separated from us by a thin layer of fabric. Suddenly, a voice whispered, "Let me in." The words were drawn out, low and raspy, like they'd been scraped from the depths of a nightmare. None of us dared to move. "Let me in," the voice repeated, this time louder. I could feel Mia's hand gripping my arm. Danny's face was pale. We were frozen, trapped in our own fear, unable to respond or react. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps started again, moving away from the tent. We exhaled in unison, relief washing over us, but it was short-lived. As the footsteps faded into the distance, we heard a low laugh, echoing through the forest. "Let's go," Danny whispered, grabbing his flashlight. We stumbled out of the tent, clutching our bags, ready to leave. But as we looked around, we realized something horrifying. In every direction, about 10 feet from our tent, were footprints circling us over and over again. And then we saw him, the figure in the distance, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching us. His face was obscured by the darkness, but we could make out his twisted smile, like he'd been waiting for us to notice him. Just beside him was what looked like a person hanging from a rope. "That's impossible," I thought to myself. How could he have done that without us hearing it? Was it even real? We didn't wait any longer. We grabbed our gear and ran, stumbling through the forest, not caring where we went as long as it was away from him. But the footsteps followed us, steady and relentless. Every time we looked back, he was closer. Finally, after what felt like hours, we reached the road where our car was parked. We piled in, locking the doors, hearts beating as we sped away. We never came back for our tent. We all figured it wasn't worth the risk. Thanks for watching and diving into these creepy stories with me. If you enjoyed the chills and want more scary horror stories, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss out on the next video. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.